Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Steve Levy, Ipsos Canada's Chief Client Officer. Steve, you have the floor.
Ellen, thank you. It's a sunny day here in Midtown Toronto, and I'm going to share with you the 14th edition of the Canadian Digital Pulse Study. I can barely believe that it's been 14 years that I've been doing this. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my camera off so that you'll hear the storyteller in the background, and you'll see the story, of course, in the foreground. So 14 years. So much has changed since January 1 of 2020. It really is hard to fathom how much has changed. I have to tell you that in the short space of just 5 weeks, we saw changes in trends that I don't think I've ever seen in my career. We saw trends moving, for example, from 8 to 30% of Canadians feeling that there was a threat to their personal health. 17 to 75% of Canadians making the point that this is a scenario that will impact their personal finances. 15 to 63%, this is a threat to Canada. And 17 to 52, it's a threat to my job. I mean, we've just never seen trend lines look like this over a short space of weeks. We seem to have moved from a culture of one where there was very much a fear of missing out on things to one which was essentially a joy of missing out. And then most recently, a fear of going out, a distrust, if you like, of perhaps brands and in fact individuals outside. And Canada is not sprinting, we're walking back. We see many activities today as being very risky. Whether it's visiting shopping malls, using public transport, most certainly going to large events, and flying, too risky, too risky. And of course, all of these things impact advertisers in this country. And at the same time, as we've seen before in times of change, our language is changing as well, our lexicon. So we're seeing new words come into our vocabulary. I don't know if these will remain or if they will disappear when things perhaps return to some sense of normalcy. And amidst this circumstance is when we did the 14th wave of the Digital Pulse Study, which is intended to assess, if you like, the digital marketing landscape. Now, of course, the word digital is somewhat nebulous and meaningless because everything these days is digital or could be perceived to be so. But very specifically, the intent here was to measure current levels of familiarity and usage with a number of different tactics, if you like, that sit under the digital umbrella, and to gauge sentiment on some current and future state digital marketing initiatives. And where appropriate, to integrate some consumer perceptions. So I'm not going to cover everything included in the study. There was an enormous raft of things that we covered, but I'm not going to talk to many of them. They are all actually contained in a report that resides at the Canadian Marketing Association website. And it was with Canadian Marketing and Strategy magazine that we partnered to do this study. If you're a member of CMA, you have access to this report. Each year before we release the findings, and this year we released them on October the 8th, so very recently, we do 2 sessions, one with marketers, one with agencies. And here you see the logos of those that have taken part over the years. And we run those sessions partly to give marketers and agencies a sneak preview as to what we found, and partly to use them as a sounding board to interpret the results. This year, you can see here the agencies and marketers that helped us with the study. And indeed, we had a special advisory group. We have one every year. So special thanks to Nick Palmer, Susan Irving, Matt Romella, and Megan Namath, all of whom helped us ensure that this study was relevant and up to date. So we did survey some 500 marketers and agencies, and that covered most of the angles, if you like, of the economy, certainly those that advertise. And as I mentioned earlier, to supplement the study, we also surveyed the public on a number of issues. And you can see here we surveyed 890 Canadians. So if I step back for a moment, one can't talk about the notion of digital marketing to marketers and agencies because that term is meaningless. So back in 2006, with an advisory group that included Mitch Joel at the time, who was leading Twist Image, the agency, Louise Clements, who was at Rogers, and some folks at the CMA, we constructed, if you like, 10 components that sit under the digital umbrella. That was way back in 2006. Now, over time, that number has changed. It's grown as the field has become more complicated. Sometimes it contracted as we saw that things were fads rather than trends. And as we sit here in 2020, there were in fact 14 different tactics or components that we looked at under this umbrella of digital marketing. Here are the 14. Now, I'm not going to read them all to you. And as you browse through this list of 14, I have no doubt that some of you will come to the conclusion that perhaps we missed something. And of course, you might be right. And similarly, you might disagree with some of the tactics that we've placed under digital. And you too might be right. But this was, at least for 2020, our starting point, and the 14 tactics that we looked at. I'm not going to cover the 14 tactics today. They are all contained in the report that I made mention of, but I am going to touch on 7 of them, as well as a couple of other issues. So we'll start with familiarity and usage of these 7 different digital marketing tactics. The first one is email marketing. And you can see here the definition that we use and that marketers and agencies who completed the survey would have seen, so that we had a level playing field. Here what you see is a 10-year trend line. And you're going to see a few slides that look like this to allow you to get used to it. So here's familiarity. In gold is marketers, and in blue is agencies. And what should become blatantly apparent to you is that email marketing is a mature tactic that sits under the digital umbrella. It's probably the most mature tactic. And indeed, familiarity remains very strong. It's a little bit lower among agencies, which I'm going to come back to in a moment, but it is strong. And here's frequent usage. Now, I should be very clear that the lines on the top reflect those who are very familiar, the top end of the scale, if you like. And the lines on the bottom reflect those who are marketers and agencies who use this tactic always or often. Again, the top end of the scale. So we've seen a slight decline in familiarity among agencies. Now that could be a function of the fact that marketers continue to take this tactic in-house. And that's partly a function of the fact that there's some substantial investment to be made, mostly in technology and software. Partly a function of the fact that there's probably a privacy component here, particularly for financial institutions. And partly the fact that it's become a specialized area and that agencies increasingly simply don't have the bench strength and the expertise to be doing this stuff. That doesn't mean that they're not involved with email marketing. They may be, particularly from a content development perspective, but much less so from a deployment perspective. So email marketing in this country, alive, strong, and healthy from a marketing and agency perspective. If we flip for a moment to the public, here's the perspective, if you like, from the public's perspective. So here's past 6 months having received a promotional email. 8 in 10 Canadians continue to say that that's the case. 6 in 10 Canadians responded to a promotional email. So this is permission-based marketing, if you like. And here's the real kicker. Almost 8 in 10 Canadians willing to receive information via this medium. So this is not really a statement about how effective email marketing it is, but it certainly is a statement about how acceptable it is. Now, yeah, the numbers on the right-hand side of this slide have moved down a little, and that might be related to the plethora of email marketing that we've seen through the course of the COVID pandemic. There's lots of great examples of email marketing. The one I've used here are the emails that many of us have seen from Galen Weston, which in most cases don't reflect an attempt to sell us something or point us in the direction of a promotion. In most cases, he's talking about caring and being close to Canadians. So it really is a kind of a heartfelt approach, but good example of email marketing for sure. The second component that I'm going to touch on is search. Search, of course, is now table stakes, and it's a shorter term play, which is in line with what's happening in the current environment. Again, large majority of agencies and marketers very familiar with search. Bit of a gap between the marketers and agencies, but again, most people are. And here you see frequent usage of search, which continues to move up, reflecting really the fact that it's an elemental nature for the consumer. And of course, for marketers, it's become an even bigger issue during the course of COVID. The third component that I'm going to touch on briefly is digital signage. And here you can see the definition that we use for digital signage that you and your peers as marketers would have responded to. Here again, you see the 10-year trend. Here's those who are very familiar, and here's frequent usage, which, as you can see, dipped in the past year, particularly among marketers. Now, is this a function of the fact that the public's simply not outdoors, and therefore outdoor media was down? For sure. It is most certainly partly a function of that. I mean, the public's simply not out there. And tied to that, to some degree, is the use of location-based technology. Up until 2018, we saw 40% of marketers agreeing that this was part of their campaigns. In 2019, that moved up to half the marketing community. And then, of course, not too surprisingly, it dropped off the map this year. Again, partly a function of the fact that the public's simply not out and about, and partly likely tied to some concerns about privacy. Social is the next component of the mix that I'm going to touch on. And again, you can briefly here see the definition that we used for those that completed the survey. Here, the trend line again runs 10 years, and everyone now, of course, is very familiar with social. And here you can see frequent usage, which continues to grow. I mean, social has become part of the fabric of marketing. It's part of the glue, with the vast majority of agencies and marketers alike not only being familiar, but also frequently using it, despite, I should say, the negative press and bans, for want of a better word, that we saw earlier in the year. Now, if we flip back to the Canadian public for a moment, here what you see is that 9 in 10 Canadians tell us that they are very worried about privacy and security in terms of their own personal information. Okay, so that's the way they feel. At the same time, 7 in 10 tell us that they've not changed their social media habits over the past few months. Only 16%, and that's moving down, have been careful about what they post on social media, and only 8% have stopped using some, that's just some, of their social media platforms. This year, we added a variable. 9% have stopped using some social media platforms in a protest, if you like. So at the left-hand side of this slide, you see a lot of concern, and on the right-hand side, you don't see much action. The public simply is not changing the way that it behaves, not in terms of usage. But what we do see is perhaps some indication of change with regard to engagement, because we see numbers moving down in terms of visiting some sites, in terms of liking, in terms of sharing, and in terms of willingness to receive. Now, is this a function, again, of the plethora of stuff that we've seen on social during the course of COVID? Maybe. Maybe it's a lead indicator. But we certainly have seen some move down on the engagement side of things. At the same time, the marketing community appears to hover its finger over the pause button, but no one actually presses it. Only 18% of marketers agree that brand safety and community policy concerns have caused them to reduce their spend on social media. Can't be done. It's part of the glue of marketing these days. Online video is the next tactic that I'm going to touch on. And here again, you can see the definition that was used to help marketers understand what we were getting at in order that they could respond to the survey. And here you see the 10-year trend line on familiarity. So almost 8 in 10 agencies very familiar, 7 in 10 marketers very familiar. And here you see frequent usage, which continues to move up. Now, we did see a slight drop in familiarity among marketers, you can see there. And we see that partly as a function of the fact that there's just more platforms out there offering more video at scale. There's more video in terms of it being customized and targeted. And there's more brands creating video. So there's just more out there, and therefore one can understand why there's perhaps a little less familiarity. But usage has most certainly moved up. And if you take a look at engagement, actually we see engagement moving up as well across all 3 of these dimensions. Online video is a must in terms of a component of the digital media mix now. The next component that I'm going to touch on is influencer marketing. And our advisory group this year suggested that we tinker a little bit with the definition. So we went from that somewhat long definition to something a little shorter. And I'm pausing here to ensure that everyone's got a chance to have just a quick glance through what we meant by influencer marketing. If we look at the 10-year trend for influencer marketing, and again, I've added the last year in blue because we did tinker with the definition. So any changes could, I suspect not, but could be a function of the definition. Either way, familiarity was essentially flat, certainly those who are very familiar. But at the same time, we most certainly saw a drop in the use of influencer marketing by agencies, a clear and apparent drop. Now, why is that the case? Well, it could be a function of the fact that much of the influencer world is tied to experiential marketing, which of course during COVID has at least in part evaporated. That's also true for sponsorship, where we see a lot of influencer marketing, which also has to some degree evaporated. But there also seems to be a bit of a negative halo these days around influencer marketing, and that's driven by a growing lack of authenticity and in some cases outright fraud. There's also some concern about new regulations that are about transparency. And where there's transparency, that begets skepticism on the consumer's part. So for sure that's an issue. And perhaps last but not least, perhaps there's also some thinking about a lack of control. An element, of course, in the world of influencer marketing that marketers cannot totally be sure that the influencers are going to say or do what they'd like them to say, and therefore there's an embarrassment factor. There's lots of great examples that demonstrate that, but not the time today to talk to them. The next component that I'm going to touch on is augmented reality, which we started to include in the program in 2018. So yeah, familiarity has been moving up. It's in the in the 20s or high teens, depending on if you're a marketer or an agency. But by and large, frequent use has remained flat and or non-existent. Truth is that ROI remains a bit of a question, and it's expensive. It's expensive, and it's debatable as to whether or not AR is scalable. Now, conversely, some of our colleagues in the agency world have made the point that, well, perhaps not everyone is entirely clear about what we're talking about, and that AR is often baked into other solutions that marketers, frankly, aren't aware of. And that may be true. I'm going to switch gears now out of the components, the tactics of digital marketing, talk just for a moment about spend on digital media. This is probably the slide that we get questioned most about, certainly from the media. It's a relatively simple question because all we ask marketers to do for each of these media is to indicate whether or not they felt that their spend next year, assuming it remained constant, would go up, stay the same, or move down. And what we do is we simply look at the net difference. And the pattern that you see here is not totally different from what we've seen in previous years, where the net negative change sits with what you might think of as traditional media, and the gains are all with what you might think of as digital. Now, we're not suggesting for a moment that this is a reflection of the dollars shifting. It is a reflection of the sentiment that sits in the marketing community. And do we think that the dollars are following the sentiment? They are. Not necessarily in these proportions, but they are. Now you can see here that the biggest net gain is with social. So the question then becomes, well, where specifically? And so what you're seeing here is the where specifically. The biggest gains that marketers see and agencies see are with Instagram, both last year and this year. YouTube is up this year. Facebook is down, but perhaps not as much as you might think. And TikTok, coming from a base of almost nothing, is now up considerably. We're also interested to try and understand where social marketing is going to increase in terms of whether it would be paid ads on social platforms or some of what you might think of as the two-way dialogue issues. And it seemed clear, this year at least, that social feels at least like it's becoming more one-way than it used to be. If you've seen the media release from the study that we put out on the 8th of October, you will have noticed that it highlights this issue. Look, over the years, reliance on agencies of all kinds really acts in the manner of a pendulum. Some years we see clients very much relying on their agencies. Things change. They decide to outsource or headcount issues come into play. Things move back and forth in terms of reliance on agencies. It's almost like there's a 6-year scenario. And what you see here going back to 2010 is exactly that scenario. And what I'd ask you to do is focus on the gold bar numbers. So these numbers reflect the proportion of marketers who indicate that they are increasing their reliance on agencies. So 50% were increasing their reliance back in 2010. And between then and 2013, that moved down to 38. Things turned around. Between 2013 and 15, it bounced back. Agencies were in better shape. Then between 2015 and 18, things turned around again. In 2019, we saw that 50% of clients indicated that their reliance on agencies was increasing. And then COVID hit. And things changed. For sure they changed. And indeed, many of you listening who are in the agency world will likely understand this or the harsh reality of this. And it wasn't just a media agency issue. It was also a creative issue. So both sides of that equation were hit, for sure. So, of course, the interest then becomes, well, where are clients relying on their agencies? Where are they hybriding, if you like, and where are they outsourcing? And what you can see here is that we've looked at all of the digital components that we use as part of this program, and we have a sense of where things are being in-housed, where they're being shared with their agency, and where they're being outsourced. So things that are more core to the business, email marketing, website, social, and increasingly SEM, are more in-house. Things that are newer, perhaps more specialized, whether it's esports and gaming, wearables, programmatic, augmented reality, and maybe digital audio, are outsourced more. Of course, the hybrid numbers are also fairly big. So that requires the need for agencies and clients to build solid bridges to ensure that the synergies are being taken advantage of. The the last few points that I want to make are really about some current perspectives. Again, if you have access to the report, I can tell you there were many perspectives that we looked at. I'm going to share just a few here. The first relates to how effective marketing agencies believe their digital marketing initiatives have been. 52% in 2019 felt that they were actually very effective. And that moved up in 2020. Very effective. But when we look a little deeper at understanding where that effectiveness is, it's almost all at the top end of the funnel, increasing awareness. And as you look at helping acquire customers and market growth and better ROI, it's not that these aren't typically there. It's more that this is really the reality of the economy that we're in right now. And in that circumstance, senior management is actively involved, more so than they were last year. Not surprisingly, with all the complexity that we've touched base on, we see that 28% of marketers say that they have trouble keeping up with digital marketing. It's a complex field. And in that circumstance, for the second time, we introduce a term that simply does not exist. Digital dappling is critical to the success of our brand. There's no such thing as digital dappling. And yet 15% of the marketing community agreed that this was something that was critical to the success of their brand. Look, we don't introduce bogus terms to poke fun at the marketing community, but really to emphasize the fact that what you guys do is complicated. And when I was a young brand guy, I only had 4 line items in my budget. I had TV, radio, out of home, and print. This is what many of you guys deal with, a landscape fraught with complexity. We would have been tone deaf had we not included a few elements in the survey this year that relate to COVID itself. And some 24% of you agreed that COVID has in fact fundamentally changed the way that you approach digital marketing. A third of you almost decided to go dark for a period during this time. And about the same number mentioned that you'd shifted from traditional to digital, obviously part of this kind of short-term initiative, which is quite understandable. We're not out of the woods yet. For sure we're not. We have a long way to go. I'm going to leave you with 5 points. First is that COVID has had a massive impact on marketing and even more so the agency world. That budgets continue to shift to digital, and that's only been accelerated by what we've seen in the last 8 months. And COVID has kind of pushed us into some respects a shorter term view of the world. That some tactics are up, online video, email marketing, and social. Some are in a circumstance where we're not really where we are in fact rather holding our breath on them. AR, wearables, and digital audio. And there are others where we need to work a little harder to make them work. And influencer marketing would be a good example of that. There's no question that complexity and speed of change create a constant need for you to reevaluate and re-educate. And again, we are not out of the woods yet. And on that note, I'm going to jump back into camera mode and ask if there are any questions. So I'm going to pause here as I look at the blinking little circle. And at this point, I don't see any questions. So I'm going to pause again for a while. I'm happy to take questions now, or if you'd like to email them to us, that's fine too. You can reach me at steve.levy@ipsos.com. Ellen, do we have any questions that I'm not seeing at this point?
No, not at this very moment. I'm pausing and speaking slowly, thinking that maybe someone is typing something, but at this moment, there are no questions in the question box.
Okay, well, in that case, I will thank everyone again and leave it to you, Ellen, to close out.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for joining us for today's excellent webinar. That now concludes today's session. Wait. There's questions. I'm going to prompt them to you now.
Yeah.
We'll take the questions and then we'll close out.
Okay. I'm going to lean in because I really got to read this question. Can you speak about customer journey mapping? I guess I could. It was not part of this survey, but that is really a subject unto itself. So I'm going to deflect that question. But if I could read your name, I'm not going to. If you'd like to reach out to me, more than happy to talk about it. Given the coming changes to cookies, how do you see the landscape changing? That's an excellent question. And in fact, it's something that the advisory group discussed at length and that we did not choose to cover in the current survey, but we likely will in the next one. Clearly, there's going to be an impact. We simply don't know what it'll be yet. But by the time next year rolls around, we're hoping to get an assessment on that. And I think that's it. Ellen, back to you.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. Okay, great. Well, be on the lookout, as I said, for a link to today's recorded webinar. That now concludes today's session. Have a most wonderful day.
Thank you.